All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. I'm Scott Horton, and now I'm happy to welcome Doug Bandow back to the show. He's a fellow at the Cato Institute. Has an archive of old stuff at antiwar.com as well. And I'm going to ask him about Libya, I think, at least to start here. Welcome back to the show, Doug. How's things?
Happy to be on. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Appreciate you joining us today. Let me ask you this, first of all. Are you personally surprised, shocked, taken aback, or anything like that about the current abuse of the war power by President Obama in the case of the war in Libya?
No, I mean, most every president does that. I think you have to go back to Eisenhower to actually find somebody who seemed to respect Congress's role, in terms of foreign policy and declaring war. And he was a former general, a pretty significant one. Most of the presidents since then have basically figured they want to be kind of armchair generals, and off they go without Congress's assent. Mm-hmm. It's really frustrating. This president, of course, was a lecturer in constitutional law at law school, but that didn't, still hasn't made him any more willing to, abide by the Constitution or the law either.
Yeah. Well, George H.W. Bush and his administration said, well, we didn't need a authorization from Congress. We had an authorization from the UN Security Council, but we're more than happy for them to go ahead and approve what we're doing anyway. And they did, right? And George Bush basically made the same claim about Iraq, but he went ahead and went to Congress anyway. And I'm trying to remember, I guess Bill Clinton did not when it came to Kosovo.
Yeah, but Bush's father, George H.W., did essentially the same thing on his Iraq war. He made the claim I could do it anyway, but in fact they had congressional votes.
Right.
So I'm willing to give the guy something, even if he's out there claiming he has the right to do it by himself, if at least he does go to Congress and Congress votes. At least we have somebody we can now try to hold responsible.
Well, and Reagan bombed Libya, but just for a day or two, and then quit.
That's right. I mean, there, of course, he told us, it wasn't going to last very long. And then he said, well, it comes under war powers. But then he said, well, it's just so small, it doesn't really count. While they're overseas telling everybody how much we're doing and demanding everybody else do more because we're doing a lot. So they're talking out of both sides of the mouth.
Mm-hmm. Well, and, that's the thing, too, about this is, I guess the part about it to me that gets me the most is just how ridiculous and stupid this is. I mean, how in the world do you get us into a war in Libya, one where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said yesterday, we have no idea how this is going to end or when or what. We're just hoping it works out for the best.
Yeah,
and this is really
bad. The
bad.
Secretary said there's no vital interest at stake. So you wonder, what on earth are we doing there? Who knows?
Well, I mean, you could see how the French and the British have oil interests there, and I guess Obama made the mistake of saying Gadhafi must go too early, but I don't know. How do you see this thing ending?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think over time, it's harder for Gadhafi to survive, but so far he's proved to be fairly resilient. I mean, they keep ratcheting things up just a little bit. They're desperate. They thought it was going to be merely a matter of saying we're going to do something and he would fall or go away. He didn't. So then they send in a few military advisors, and then they send in a half dozen helicopters, and then they shoot a few more missiles. I mean, this sort of thing is not working. I mean, it's amazing. They essentially lie, and they say it's just to save lives, so they get UN approval for that. And then they admit, well, we want to get rid of him, but they won't do what it takes to get rid of him, which means more people are dying. I mean, civil wars are bloody, so they're making it drag on, and more people are being killed. It's ludicrous.
Yeah, it is amazing. And, there was that piece and I really should talk to this guy, but I forget his name. Jonathan something, I think, writing for the New Yorker, said, hey, look, there's 1,000 armed men. That's the rebellion.
That's right. I mean, the problem is they're not organized, they're not well trained, so we've seen some trainers go over from Europe, and that might help a little bit. But this is still, to take over a country is not easy, especially one like this where there are fairly significant, distances. So they're now just kind of in a stalemate. Each side holds a bit, and they're not able to do anything to the other side.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we saw in Egypt, Mubarak tried to say, hey, this is a CIA plot to unseat me. And the entire country laughed out loud in unison and said, no, dude, you're a CIA plot, and that's why we're getting rid of you. And they did. And, right now, The King of Bahrain is trying to accuse the Americans of being behind the protest to unseat him when, of course, the Americans are behind him and have been. But you see what an effective talking point that is. The Americans are the bad guy on the so-called Arab street over there, and we probably couldn't have done a thing better to prop up Gadhafi in power than this intervention, it seems like to me. We're proving that we are definitely on the side of the rebellion, which only makes him the good guy, at least among the people who, tended toward him in the first place.
And the point is, we don't really know who all these people are. I mean, some of these people look like they're fairly nice people, but those are not often the people who win revolutions. It's the people who have the guns and the toughest people. So we don't know who's going to come out of this. I mean, there are defectors from the Gadhafi regime. Well, if you're telling me that Gadhafi's an evil, horrible guy, well, these defectors probably aren't very nice people either. Well, what role do they play in a new government? I mean, like the former interior minister. I mean, this is a nasty character. This is the guy whose job it was to jail everybody before. Well, he's now supposedly one of the good guys. I mean, we don't have any reason to assume that the outcome here is going to be pretty.
Yeah, well, what's fun for me, and this we can only speculate, but I like to imagine the conversation in the White House on the National Security Council that got us into this thing in the first place. I mean, how could they have blundered into a war so badly? Robert Gates, the Secretary of Defense, said, we should not intervene here. There's no such thing as just a no-fly zone, guys, 2 weeks before it started.
Well, that's right. I mean, apparently State Department people have acknowledged to, some journalists privately that they really thought that all that was going to happen is, NATO would announce it was going to do something, the U.S. would announce it, and Gadhafi would either fly into exile or he'd be overthrown and they'd be done with it. I mean, they didn't learn anything. We had this in Kosovo. The Clinton administration thought, we just kind of bomb a couple of days and he'll give in. But instead, it took 78 days. They didn't know what to do. All they could do is keep bombing. They had no plan B. They didn't expect him to resist. They didn't know what they were doing. And that's where we're at now. We're more than 78 days now. Nobody knows how to end this. We're eating up costs. We're bankrupt, and we're spending all this money. And we're killing people. And the question is, for what? And it's very hard to explain what on earth we're doing. Why do we care who rules Libya?
Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. I mean, I can see why the Europeans want a better deal on the oil they're pumping out of the ground there, that they get a higher percentage or whatever, but I ain't sure why Americans got to pay for that or die for that. But now, so what's Obama's choices here? All I see are land invasion or Bay of Pigs.
Well, he has no good options because the one thing which, most Democrats and certainly and even most Republicans, other than, say, crazy John McCain, they don't want a ground war. I mean, this John Boehner resolution, which was really a sellout, but still, it affirmed that the House certainly didn't want ground troops involved. So the one thing there's no support for in the U.S. is ground troops. But there's no reason to think that what they're doing now is going to have any impact. We could be doing this for another 6 months. So Obama, and I think for Obama, that's a disaster. I mean, right now he just hopes it kind of stays off the front pages and nobody pays attention. But if it's going on from 6 months from now, people are going to be screaming about the cost and saying, what on earth are you doing? And we're heading towards a presidential election. But he doesn't want to use ground troops. So maybe at that point he really unleashes air power and hopes that does it. He's in a very bad situation.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know. It seems like no matter what happens, they refuse. Gaddafi's offered, let's work out some kind of peace over and over again. They refuse to meet with him or acknowledge that whatsoever. They're really painting themselves into a corner here.
And, from their standpoint, what might be even worse is, say it takes another 3 months, but Gaddafi's finally overthrown, and then there's just another civil war. Because then it's a struggle within the rebels and what's left of Gaddafi's forces for control. So then the U.S. is stuck with, now what do you do? I mean, we're already, if the rebels are mistreating people, we said we bombed the rebels. I mean, this is insane.
Right. Well, and as we know from the British press, a lot of these rebels are veterans of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, where they practiced orchestrating suicide bombings against Americans. So once we win for them, we're going to have to hold purple finger elections and make sure that they're not the ones.
That's right.
Yeah, we'll see. All right, hang tight, everybody. It's Doug Bandow from Cato. We'll be right back. All right, y'all, welcome back to the show. It's Anti-War Radio. Doug Bandow's on the line. We're predicting the worst, more of the worst to come from this fiasco in Libya. And And I guess, Doug, somebody could get lucky with a missile strike. This is pretty much where we left off. Somebody could get lucky with a missile strike and kill this Gadhafi character. But then as soon as we ask, then what? All of a sudden we're back in Iraq 2004.
That's right. I mean, the point is, you get rid of him, who succeeds him? It's not as if, this is Thomas Jefferson is obviously there. It's not as if these people have a history of democracy. It's not as if that we still don't have important regional and tribal divisions, which, of course, no one in the White House has any idea about. I mean, this is typical of the White House, Brussels. These people jump into a conflict without knowing anything about it. And the cheerleaders are people like John McCain, who 2 years ago was in Tripoli, having dinner with Gadhafi, talking about giving him military aid. So, I mean, he was, for, autocracy before he was against it. I mean, it's outrageous to listen to these people.
Right, yeah, well, and he wasn't just there talking about it. He was there twisting Gadhafi's arm, telling him, are you going to sign this thing or not?
And talking about military aid. I mean, it's crazy. He apparently somewhere along the line realized that Gadhafi's not a nice guy. Well, great. Thank you for waking up.
Right. Well, he was anti-Gadhafi before he was pro-Gadhafi, before he was anti-Gadhafi.
He was pro before he was anti or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, man. All right, well, so, I don't know, Doug, you're supposed to be reasonable and tell me now, Scott Horton, you and your hyperbole, tone it down here. We're not going to have purple-fingered elections and a decade-long occupation, and yet you're telling me, yeah, afraid so. Sounds like.
Well, it's hard to imagine how they can walk away. I mean, assume, the NATO was just out there saying, oh, don't worry, we're not going to put any troops on the ground. But look, Gadhafi goes, and then there's still civil war. Gadhafi goes, and there's still fighting. Assume Gadhafi goes, now the rebels are killing each other. It's hard to imagine how we would stay out. We say, we want to save people, and what if it looks like Al-Qaeda and radicals are ready to take control? What if it, suggests that Tripoli is going to be ruled by guys who we view as terrorists? I mean, how can they stay out? And how can you tell the American people this is worthwhile if the whole thing blows up, after your alleged victory? So I think, it's very likely we're going to be involved.
Well, and here's the problem, too, and this is something I've been saying since before they blundered in here, is, hey, guess what? This is another Sunni Arab country, another place where Americans are doing exactly what bin Laden accused us of doing and predicted we would do and is trying to get us to do. Overextend ourselves in their part of the neighborhood where we run out of money and radicalize all the locals.
Yeah, he may be dead, but the point is, he's won. I mean, he got us to do precisely what he wanted us to do, which has been a disaster. We've spent trillions of dollars, gotten thousands of our own people killed, killed hundreds of thousands of other people, because he was able to stage a terrorist attack. From his standpoint, this has been great. We've completely overreacted. We've given him what he wanted. We've created enormous numbers of enemies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jeff Huber wrote a piece the other day, last week or something, 2 weeks ago, called Bin Laden Dead and Loving It. Said he's got to be the most successful military genius in the history of the world.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Makes Alexander the Great look like an amateur.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, seriously, could Alexander the Great have figured out how to get the Indians to just completely defeat themselves,
Yeah, to kind of bankrupt themselves, make lots of enemies around the world. It's extraordinary.
All right, well, so now, I guess, give me some good news about Syria. Tell me that at least they're too smart to stick their nose into Syria, or worse, Pakistan. Worse than they are anyway.
Well, I think they realize that military intervention in a place like Pakistan would be catastrophic. That is, military intervention directly against the government. But, of course, that's a place where our drone attacks continue to anger Pakistanis. This is a place that's kind of losing any sense of a liberal civil society. I mean, that's a place that's frightening. And if it implodes, who knows what the U.S. would do. Syria, I think they realize that this is kind of one step too far. Oh, my goodness, what do you do there? I mean, are you prepared to take on their military, and then what happens? Who knows what that place looks like? And are you prepared for purple finger elections there? I mean, my hope is simply they know they've got too much on their plate, and especially that President Obama wants to get reelected, I don't think he sees any advantage to suddenly launching more wars and especially putting more U.S. troops on the ground. That's the way I think to get the American people don't care if it looks like a video game, but if guys are on the ground getting shot and coming back in body bags, they have a very different reaction. I think Obama knows that.
Yeah, well, I sure hope that's true. I mean, but then again, he thought he was going to get away with nothing but an air war here, and he's fought us a decades-long catastrophe in Libya. So, who knows what they could convince themselves about how easy a war in Pakistan might be, or an attempt to go in there and seize their nukes. I kind of get the idea. My gut's telling me, hey, any full-scale war, against the state in Pakistan is absolutely ludicrous. There's just no way they could do that, and yet I'm getting the idea that there are people in Washington, D.C., who are extremely concerned that others are really people with power are really convincing themselves that maybe it's time to head that way.
I actually think that it's more likely that they would decide to cut off aid than that they would try to put in some kind of full-scale military action against the government. I think that there's enough recognition here that that's a fragile place, that would blow everything up. And at least nominally it has a democratic government. Syria, they can look at it and say, well, we'd be taking on, thugs and whatnot. In Pakistan, they'd have to admit after all this that, in fact, they really weren't dealing with the democratic government, and then what we were doing and why were we giving it money. And I'm a little more hopeful, I think, than you are on Pakistan, where I think they understand it'd be such a hideous mess that it's hard for me to, and I think, again, this president, prior to an election year, really can't afford that, and I think he knows that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly bribing the military and the intelligence services and, the so-called parliament over there to allow us to, have a JSOC, drone war, et cetera, in their country is one thing. But, any attempt to take their nuclear weapons, which is really a declaration of war against the state that we've been bribing, seems like just immediately the possible consequences rippling out from any such attempt immediately include, nuclear war with India. And then in that case, I guess we could probably expect China to jump in on the side of Pakistan. Or God knows what kind of horrible things we're talking about in that case.
Yeah, and I think, luckily at least, I think the president probably understands that. You want to really blow up the world. I mean, that's the way to do it. Get involved there, get into a conflict, trigger things. There's no stopping point where it all could go.
Right. Well, and I mean, then again, though, as you say, under the secret war, so-called, that we have now, we're risking the disintegration of the Pakistani state as it is. That's
right. Yeah, it's a very bad situation.
Incredible. All right. Well, at least I'm happy to hear you say that reason has some sway of some description inside Washington, D.C. still. I guess we'll see how it plays out.
That's right.
Seems like this Libya thing would have disproven that once and for all, but maybe not quite. All right. We're all out of time. Thanks very much for your time, Doug, as always. I really appreciate it.
Happy to be on. Take care now.
All right, everybody. That's the great Doug Bandow from the Cato Institute.